Larry Summers, he was the guy that talked about we're going into a heavy recession. Larry Summers, this economist that just believes we need a certain amount of unemployment, a very, it's supposed to be a progressive economy. It's just a neoliberal who thinks very little about anything other than neoliberal policies. Check this out. We'll take it on the other side.
For the last few months, that the people who felt a soft landing was likely had gotten very optimistic. Somebody like Paul Krugman was saying, all the evidence is pointing in the direction that inflation has cooled. But in any advanced industrial economy, wage inflation is the most important thing. And does this tight job market get 2 vacancies for every person looking? Does this show that you still have a real inflation problem?
Fareed, you're asking the right question, and nobody can know the answer for sure. I've said often that soft landings are, as Samuel Johnson said of Second Marriage, the triumph of hope over experience. But from time to time, hope does triumph over experience. So it looks more possible that we'll have a soft landing than it did a few months ago. My continued fear, though, is exactly the one that you described, that we had a set of inflation indicators during 2022 that were very strong, that have now come back to earth, but they're still too high. They're still unimaginably high from the perspective of 2 or 3 years ago, and that getting the rest of the way back to target inflation may still prove to be quite difficult. So I'd say I'm encouraged, but it would be a big mistake to think that we were out of the woods.
So one of the things that people wonder is, suppose we end up in this situation with 3.5% inflation as the kind of norm rather than 2%, which is what most central banks target. Is it worth triggering a recession to get inflation down? How should we think about that trade-off between unemployment and inflation?
So I think the most important thing to recognize about that trade-off is that it's a trade-off between short-run reductions in unemployment and permanent changes in inflation. And so the benefit we can get from pushing unemployment low is, on almost all economic theories, likely not to be a permanent one. But if we push inflation up and those inflation expectations become entrenched, we're going to live with that inflation for a long time.
And that is what makes Larry Summers completely wrong. He could be the most educated economist, but he's an educated economist in a particular economic system that doesn't have to be. So you may know everything he knows about a capitalist structure of this type, but what he fails to tell you, listen to what he says. Very low unemployment is probably short-lived, but high inflation is probably likely long-lived. Both statements in an economy that's based first on human beings and not capitalism is a false statement. And here's the deal. We can always have everybody employed as we want to, because employment not handled by the private sector can always be taken over by the public sector. And secondly, inflation, we can put on windfall profit taxes onto these companies that give them an incentive not to inflate prices, because the money is not going to be, since they're not going to be reinvesting the money into production, it'll come right back into the country's coffers, because after all, it came from the people themselves in an economy that we created, in a society that we created, in a society that we protect with the military created by all of us. So it's not about taking away, it's taking away the spoils from those who pilfered said spoils. But we don't have an economy like that. We have an economy that says we can take advantage of people as we please.